Hello and welcome to another Just Roll With It review, where today we're taking a look at the two-player head-to-head competitive card game Netrunner / Nisei, originally by Fantasy Flight Games and now continued on by the Nisei project. This is an asymmetric card game, and it's going to take probably, I don't know what the box says for time, but you're looking at like a good hour to 2 hours? It's relatively long for a card game. Maybe if we were better, it would be shorter. So feel free to correct me on that. But before we get into the review proper, let's take a second to go ahead and take a look at the general overview of sort of like the turn structure, how the game plays, what you're looking at, the deck building, those types of things. Yeah, so let's get to that real quick. Alright, I have given myself the almost Herculean task of attempting to explain in a brief overview what the heck Android Netrunner the card game is. Essentially, it's an extremely asymmetric, head-to-head two-player card game where one player is taking control of a corporation and attempting to advance what are called agendas in order to win the game, and the other player is a hacker, or what's called a runner in universe, which is trying to then steal those agendas before they can be completed in order to score themselves points. And whoever gets a total value of 7 of those first, the runner or the corporation, is the winner. Now, there's a lot more minutia and things, but that's generally what you're doing and how you're going to win the game. So let's get into more of the specifics. And first, we're going to take a look at what cards the corporation has available to them. So quickly before I jump into an explanation of how you play a corporation, let's talk about the different corporations you can use to build your decks. So there are 4 available to you on the corporation side of things. The first one we'll look at here is Hospiroi, which is a German company that focuses specifically on cybernetics and artificial intelligence. So think, replacing humans with robots type stuff. Then we have Wayland Consortium, which is not a whole lot is known about. I'm not a huge lore expert, but based on what I can find, they built this giant space elevator that goes from New Angeles to the moon. And they are heavily involved in investing in other companies and are very shady. So a lot of investment style cards in these. We have Jinteki, which is going to be specifically working in the field of sort of science and biotechnologies. Generally that type of thing. And then we have NBN, which is the news network, and they sort of deal with broadcasting and things like that. So that's a very high-level overview. You can definitely look at each of the card pools to better understand their playstyle differences, but they definitely do have a playstyle that's unique to each of them. Obviously, in terms of being corporations, they have a lot of similarities, but they do have different playstyles for each one. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the cards for a corporation, what you're going to be putting into your deck. Now, the important thing to note here is, I know I showed the box for Netrunner earlier. That is the original core set. I do not have the revised core set. I picked this one up on sale from a used game store. Pretty much everything else that you're going to be seeing in this game is from Nisei, which is a project that is basically trying to keep Netrunner alive because Netrunner is no longer a thing. So, the Nisei cards, which we will be taking a look at here for NBN, will look something like this. So the first thing you're going to have is you're going to pick an identity to play as, right? So this is like the aspect of whatever corporation, when you're a corporation, that you're playing as. So in this case, this is sort of like a virtual game space that you're playing as. So this is called GameNet, and that sort of represents your deck. Now, you have 2 very important numbers here. You have 45, which is how many cards, the minimum amount of cards that have to be in your deck, and then you have this number on the right in this dark circle, which is the number of points from other factions that you can include in your deck. So there are ways that you can include cards from other corporations that aren't, NBN. There's just a cost, and we'll talk about that in a second. So you also have a small ability on the bottom, which is relatively straightforward. But again, this is a pretty light dive. This is not a how-to tutorial. So the first thing, and arguably the most important card in a corporation's deck, is going to be an agenda. Now, based on the number of cards that you have in your deck, again with a minimum of 45 or whatever the identity you have says, that you will be required to have a certain number of agenda points in your deck. So if you have a deck size of, let's just say, 45 to 49, you need to have 20 to 21 agenda points. So these are the agenda points. So this is basically how many victory points it's worth. And remember, one of the players has to get to 7 in order to win. So if the corporation player can basically build enough of these agendas, complete enough of these agendas, and this is how they advance them. So I have to get 3 advancement tokens on them, and we'll talk about that later. Once there's 3 advancement tokens on here, they can score the 2 points, and they put it aside. It can no longer be stolen by the runner. Now, until it gets all of those points, it can be stolen by the runner. So the runner can see that you're placing advancements on this card and try to steal it and score 2 points for themselves. And then there's usually an ability that triggers on the bottom here when it is scored. The next type of card that a corporation has available to them is an operation, which is similar to an event. It's basically a card you basically just read the card aloud, resolve its effects. This is what it would cost in the top left. So currently this is free. For instance, this one, resolve one of the following if the runner is tagged. We won't really cover tagging, but it's an effect that you can basically put on the runner. You may resolve both instead if the runner is tagged. You can gain $3. You can draw 3 cards. Very straightforward. I will mention this now since I see it on here, but if you look in this bottom left-hand corner, you will see that there's 1 pip on this sort of like 5 pip item. This would be to include this in a deck that is not an NBN deck. So if you wanted to include this card in, say, a Haas Bioroid deck, you would have to pay 1 point of your points that are listed on your identity card. So in this case, we'd have 17, so we can include up to 17 total points from other factions that are not our own. Not super important, but that is part of the deck building. So the next thing we have here is an asset. There are several different things that assets do. They're usually very good for the corporation, but the important thing to note here is some of them can be advanced, like our agendas can be advanced. Now, normally you can only advance cards that are agendas and have this advancement, but you can try to trick the runner into thinking that this is an agenda by having it be able to be advanced, which it says specifically on the card. They can do other things as well, but you'll be installing this into your servers in order to do various different effects. Then we have arguably the second most, if not the most important card that corporations can put in their deck, and that is ice, which is basically like the firewalls for your servers. So we haven't gotten to that quite yet, we'll show it in a second, but basically the corporation is sort of building various servers, which are represented by cards, and attempting to protect them with ice. So ice is what the runner needs to break through in order to steal the goodies that are in the servers you're building. Now, they do a lot of things, and they have a lot of information on them. It's interesting, so there's sort of like 2 orientations. You will play these face down, and you don't have to pay anything for them when you place them face down, other than 1 coin for each other ice that's already on a server. So if there's already 1 piece of ice on a server, so if there was a piece of ice like this, and we wanted to play this second one, we would have to pay 1 coin. If we were to play a third one, we would have to pay 2 coins, because there's 2 existing pieces of ice. Now, if this is our first piece of ice on the server, it doesn't matter. It's basically free. We have to pay for it when we want to what's called res it, which is basically when it's about to be encountered, or you can voluntarily do it later. But you don't have to pay this cost right away. So this piece of ice we could play out for free, and then when we decide to res it, we would pay this cost of 4 currency. Don't have to do that right away though, like I said. The other things to note here, this ice has a strength of 5. So this means that the runner who's trying to break this piece of ice or break the subroutines on it, which we'll talk about in a second, needs to have a strength of 5 or more on their icebreaker in order to even be able to interact with this. So they have to, this is a pretty strong one, so they would have to be able to get their icebreaker up to strength 5 or more in order to be able to interact with the text on the card. Now the most important parts of this card are the text, and what you have here is essentially, we have the type, so this is Sentry. This is an ice type of Sentry, which means you will also have to have an icebreaker, the runner will have to have an icebreaker, that can break Sentry subroutines. If they can't, then they need to suffer the effects of these subroutines. So, for instance, you can spend $2 to break one subroutine on this ice. Only the runner can use this ability. Now that's actually sort of a benefit to the runner, as the runner can basically just pay 2 money to the corporation and break the piece of ice. Or break one subroutine, rather. There are 2 subroutines, which are these little arrows. Now, normally you wouldn't have an ability to just break subroutines. You'd need to have icebreakers. Your runner would need to have icebreakers. And they would need to be able to break these Sentry subroutines. There's a whole bunch of different types of ice. So there's like barriers and code gates, and this one just happens to be a type of Sentry. So the runner then decides with the icebreaker that they have, that has to have a strength of 5 or higher in order to interact with this, they decide which subroutines they want to break. Do they want to break both of them? Do they want to just break one and suffer the effects of another? Sometimes subroutines can straight up end the run, which is obviously no good for our runner, but it is very good for the corporation. So for instance, this first subroutine add 1 installed runner card to the grip. So basically, it makes a runner take one of their cards back. We'll talk about more of that in the runner section. And then it can give the runner 1 tag, which we also are not really going to cover too much, but it's basically a bad status effect that allows the corporation to do various things to the runner while they're tagged. So if the runner manages to break all of these subroutines or decides to just suffer the consequences of the ones that they don't break, they would then pass this ice. And if this was the last piece of ice before the server, they would be able to access cards in that server. And we'll talk more about that in a moment when we take a look at the setup. But first I want to explain the cards that are on both sides, so we're going to look at the runner cards next. Alright, so now that we've taken a look at all the cards that the corporation has at their disposal, let's go ahead and look at the different types of cards that the runner has at their disposal. The runner, in my opinion, is a little bit simpler to play as. There's not quite as much going on. What you're doing is more straightforward. And they also have fewer card types. The first thing that we're going to look at, much like the corporation, you are going to have an identity card. Again, it's going to have the minimum number of cards that you can have in your deck, as well as how much influence points, or points from other cards that are not the blue cycle, you can have in your deck. And there are 3 different types of runners, so much like there was different types of corporations you could play as, we have 3 different types. We have we have Shapers, which are going to be primarily focused on trying to take down corporations, corporation injustice. We have Criminals, which are, well, criminals. And we have Anarchs, which are anarchists. So, along with your identity card, you will also have several different types of cards. So the first thing we're going to look at is resources. This is primarily how runners are going to get money. These are cards that they play into their rig. We haven't really gotten into it, but the most complicated part of this game, the thing that makes it so difficult to teach, is the fact that it has unique terminology for everything, and the terminology for things for a corporation and a runner that do the same things, like your draw deck and your discard, are actually different, which we'll talk about in a second. So resources are primarily how you're going to be getting money and other resources. You have hardware, which you can install into your rig, which is going to give you usually better stats for things, also ways to get you money. You'll find that the runner is a lot of the time trying to find ways to get money. You have events. Now this is not a blue event, this is just a neutral gray event. Both sides have neutral cards that they can pull from. But events like operations get played once. You pay the cost up in the top left, you get the benefit. In this case, you pay $5, you get $9. Pretty straightforward, and then those get discarded. And then the most important ones, we have programs, which are your icebreakers. So this is what an icebreaker would look like. It takes up a certain number of memory slots. You may have noticed that on the identity, there is a certain number of memory slots that you start with. It's usually 4, but it can change. So this will take up one of those slots. You can only have a certain number of memory for programs and things put out. But basic things like this one would break a sentry subroutine. So I think the one we were looking at earlier was a sentry subroutine. I could be wrong. So you could use this to break it, and you'd have to pay $1, and you get to break a sentry subroutine. Now, we were talking about strength earlier, the one that we were looking at. You need to have higher strength. So this only has 1 strength to start, but you can spend money to give it +1 strength. So if we need to beat that 5 strength ice from earlier, we'd have to spend $4 to get it up to 5 strength. And then we'd have to spend 2 to break the 2 subroutines on the sentry subroutine. So that's how that works. Again, in my opinion, the runner is a little bit easier to play as, but let's go ahead and, now that we've seen all the cards, let's set up the game, how it would look after a couple of turns, and sort of try to explain how the flow of the game works so that you better understand it. Okay, so out in front of us here we have an example of a game that's a few rounds in, so you can just kind of get an idea of what it looks like on the table. So, big thing here, at the beginning of the game, the corporation is going to start with 5 cards and 5 money, and the runner is also going to start with 5 cards and 5 money. But everything else, the corporation will start with their HQ, which is their identity card, which, believe it or not, is a server in the game. Their R&D, research and development, which is basically their draw pile. Their archives, which is their discard pile, and that is specifically face down so that the runner cannot see what's in it. And then the runner is going to start with simply their starting hand, as well as the stack, which is their draw pile, the identity card. Theirs is not anything special, it's just their identity card. Their heap, which is their discard pile, and nothing else. Their hand of 5 cards. And throughout the game, the runner is going to be playing cards down in this sort of configuration. So they'll have programs up at the top, hardware here, and resources here. Doesn't super matter the order you play those in, but the idea is that those are just to keep them in organized lines as they do different things. And then the corporation is going to be much more complicated. You'll have what we see in front of us here, but then you can also erect additional servers, so that's where your agendas and assets will go. And then you can place ice in front of these servers. So each one of these is a server, so you have your HQ, your research and development, your archives, and then additional servers that you're erecting and then placing ice in front of. Now, this is an unresed piece of ice, meaning they haven't paid for it, they just put it down. Later on they could res it, or when a runner tries to come and access this server, which has some, theoretically there's an agenda under here. We have some advancement tokens. But they could choose to res this and pay the cost. This one doesn't cost anything. It is free, but it also has no strength. So it does some other things. So the way it's going to work is the corporation is always going to go first. And included in the Nisei stuff, as well as the original game. The original game one looks a little bit different. In the Nisei, sort of the starter set, you have a breakdown of the basic actions you can do. So you can, for 1 click, now the corporation has 3 clicks. It's basically you get 3 actions. Different things will have that little click symbol. You can gain $1, you can draw a card, you can play 1 operation from HQ, and HQ is basically your hand of cards. So you can play 1 card from your hand of cards. You can install 1 agenda / asset / upgrade / ice from HQ. Again, HQ is your hand. You can pay $1 to end an action to advance 1 installed card, which is where you're putting these advancement tokens, which is how you're going to score agendas and win the game. And then you can also spend an action and $2 to trash 1 installed resource. If the opposing runner is tagged, so we mentioned tagging earlier, that's one of the things you can do, as well as cards will just say, like, if the runner is tagged, do X. You can also spend 3 3 actions to purge virus counter. So the corporation has 3 actions. They will also get $1 at the beginning of every turn. The runner does not get that. The corporation just gets a free money at the beginning of every turn because they're a corporation. So then over here, the runner has a very similar card. I'm not sure how well this is showing up on the camera, but we'll do our best here. So starting from the top, you have 4 actions instead of 3, so you actually get an extra action, but you also don't get a free money at the beginning of every turn. For an action, you can gain $1, draw 1 card, play 1 event from your grip, which is your hand. Again, weird vernacular for everything in this game. You can install 1 program / resource / hardware from your grip, from your hand. You can run against a server, or you can spend an action and $2 to remove one of those tags that you have built up. Now, I should note, when you buy the Nisei stuff, it is not official. It is a fan-made project, so it does not come with any of the tokens that you see up here. You will have to use either generic tokens, some people use poker chips, but it does, the Nisei stuff, again, I'm not sure how well these are going to show up on the camera, does include these nice cards that you can use to track tags, bad publicity. So you can basically just use a generic token, place it on top of that card, and say that that's what it's for, so you don't get confused. So that's basically how the game works. You know, you're gonna be using your actions to do, or your clicks to do the various actions on your card when it's your turn. The big thing the runner is going to be doing is initiating runs against servers. So when they do that, they have to have a program, you know, that can interact. We talked about that earlier. So the strength of your program is the number in the bottom. There's usually ways to increase the strength on that, and it has to match the type. So this is an icebreaker killer, and it can interface with an ice, and it can break 1 sentry subroutine. Now this is a barrier, and this is mystic. So yeah, so we can't break either of those. This is also a code gate, so this would be useless, so we'd have to wait until we get something better. But when you run against a server, you will encounter the ice starting with the outermost ice and working your way in, and as long as you don't, you know, as long as you can break these subroutines or survive whatever the effects are if you choose not to break them. There are ones that will just end the run, so you obviously have to break those if you want to get in. But you weather all the abilities on these. Again, if they are unresed, right, and the runner gets to this one and you just choose not to pay the cost to res it as the corporation, then you just get to move over it as the runner. But if they do choose to res it, then you have to encounter it. Once you've done all of that, you can get to the server. And there's a variety of different things that happen. So when you access a server, depending on the server that it is, different things will happen. So, cool. So once you access a server, it depends on what it is, different things will happen. Most of the time you're going to be accessing a card, and accessing a card is basically the corporation letting you look at that card, and if it has a trash symbol on it, which, let me see if I can find one quickly. Okay, so the way it works then is once a runner has successfully gotten past all of the ice and has reached one of your servers that you have set up here, and remember, each of these is server, so as a refresh, we have the archives over here, which is your discard pile, R&D here, we have HQ, which is essentially your hand, cards in your hand, and then we have other servers that can be erected later, so you can have multiple, you can even have upgrades on them and things like that. So when a server is accessed, if it is the HQ, so if it's your hand, the runner gets to look at 1 card from that hand at random. If R&D is accessed, then you can look at the top card of the corp deck, which would be this one here, the R&D. When archives are accessed, you can look at every card in the discard. That's why they're face down, so that when you access them, you can look at them. And then all the other servers, you can access every card in the root of the server, which is the main way that the runner is going to basically be able to score points. So there's 2 things that happen. When you access a card, if it has this little trash can symbol on the bottom, you can pay that much money and trash the card, remove it from the game. If it is an agenda, though, you have the opportunity to just straight up steal it. And this is basically how you're going to score victory points. So if you remember earlier, we were talking about how the one player, either the corporation needs to get to 7 or the runner needs to get to 7. So if we went ahead and let's say our runner got all the way into this server, right, and they accessed this card before the corporation had a chance to finish the advancement, they can steal it. And this is worth 3 victory points. So this is 3 of the 7 that they need. They set that aside. However, if the corporation was able to get all 5 of the advancement tokens on it, then the corporation would set it aside, and now they have 3 victory points. So you're basically just trying to get to 7. Whoever gets to 7 first wins. And that covers the really high-level overview. I'm sorry this was so long. This is a hell of a game to try to explain in a short period of time, and it is one of the most difficult teaches I have had to do. So we'll definitely talk more about that in the review. Without further ado, let's get back to the review. Alright, so now that we've taken a look at a general overview of kind of how the game plays, what options you have to do on your turn, again, not a rules video, but just sort of a general overview, we can talk about the game. Sam?
You know, I think it's probably one of the better like asymmetric card games, especially because you don't really see a whole lot of asymmetric card games necessarily. And I think it does a good job of making the card, like the 2 players play very differently while also making it somewhat even. And there's plenty of problems with it for sure, but I think the actual gameplay itself works pretty well.
It is very asymmetric. I didn't guess. So also for some context, we've only played it a couple of times. I've basically only played it with you. So we're not like experts on this or anything. Very much amateur, played it a couple times, think we're doing most things correctly, and just sort of like messing around with a little bit of deck building now. We just kind of play with like the starter decks that you get in this is the non-revised core set. There's apparently a newer core set that I don't have, but I just picked this up for like $20 at a used game store. So, but yeah, it is very asymmetric. Which is cool, that basically the corporation is basically playing defense, and the runner is basically playing offense and trying to break through their defenses and steal things. And the corporation is just trying to have strong enough servers that their things that the runner is trying to steal don't get stolen before they can complete them and score them, basically. Which is, relatively straightforward. There's no, like, complicated way that the game ends. It's basically just whoever gets 7 agenda points first. Which is one of the less complicated things in this game. It is definitely a very difficult game to learn. I had heard that before I played it. I had heard from a lot of people who like, had just casually played the game or learned it. They were like, it's really cool. There's a lot of potential there, but wow, it is not friendly to new players. There's like no good way to get into this game unless you have someone who's like really good at teaching and really knows the game, which I did not. We ended up having to, so I read like the rules and we sat down to play it, and I ended up having to like look up YouTube videos to make sure that what we were doing was right. And like the best video we found was just an old Fantasy Flight one that was made that kind of gave us an idea of how the game works. But the weird thing is once you break through that, like the game itself is really not that complicated. There seems like there's a lot going on and stuff, but once you know how to play like your side, it's not too bad. At least that's kind of was my experience. But yeah, I mean, do you want to talk about the language?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, each player in an asymmetric game, each player. You'd think that even if they were going to have like their thematic language for the game, which they definitely do, but you'd think that they'd make it for both players. But in this case, they actually made it so each player has their own language for each individual thing to learn. So like the draw pile and discard pile are not called the draw pile and discard pile. I believe one's the stack, the draw pile, and the heap for the runner. And then you've got like all of your cards. They're given different labels like programs and hardware. And then for the corporation player, you have your HQ, which is just like your player card.
But it's also like your hand of cards when it gets access, because it's also a server. So if someone breaks into HQ, the runner breaks into HQ, they're accessing your hand of cards. So your hand of cards are also like part of your HQ, which is represented by your identity card. And then you have R&D, which is your draw pile for the corporation, and then you have archives, which is your discard pile. And the archives are face down because the runner can run against those and access them, and flip them up and look at them. So everything has its own terminology, and that makes the game... I don't think that's the only thing that makes the game difficult to teach. I think there's other things as well, but I think that is a huge contributing factor to... It's not just called the draw pile, it's not just called the discard. Everything has a name, and not only does everything have a name, but it has two names, because the runner has one name and the corporation has another one. And that makes the game super difficult to learn. Is it kind of neat from a thematic standpoint? Sure, but like, it doesn't... I mean, would you argue that it really adds to the game's theme, the fact that everything has a name? I guess I kind of get it for the corporation a little bit. Because they have to represent game elements. Because these are basically servers. Your HQ, your R&D, your archives are all servers that can basically be accessed.
These are just like they just came up with words that represent draw and discard pile, and they're like, that works.
Yeah, and
you also can't forget about the damage. There's like 3 different types of damage, and 2 of them are basically the same thing.
Well, they're all basically the same thing.
But one of them just limits your hand size, but otherwise, they basically do the same thing.
What is it? Meat damage. And what is the other one? I can't even think of what it is right now. There's meat damage, and there's brain damage, which is the really bad one. That's like the perma one. I don't remember what it's called. Is it like... I don't know. Doesn't matter. Point is, there are like 3 types of damage. 2 of them, which are just like the common ones, basically just make the runner randomly discard a card from their hand. And then brain damage, or I think they're calling it core damage now in Nisei. I don't know why. Because their card calls it brain damage. Permanently reduces your hand size, and if you get, 6? Yeah, 6 brain damage, you can lose the game as the runner. I've never again, we've only played a few games, a handful of games. Never come across a card that does brain damage. So I don't... and that's sort of the weird thing, too. There's also... I think I briefly mentioned in the overview video, and I basically said multiple times, like, I'm not really going to cover this. You can worry about it when you get to it, but there's bad publicity, which the runner can give to the corporation, which does things. I think it mostly just... It's things on cards, right? Is there an action that the runner has to do? I think
there is that, maybe.
I know for the corporation,
I know you can pay stuff to get rid of
it. You can trash one installed resource if the person is tagged.
Yeah.
So the runner can give the corporation bad publicity, and I don't remember what the inherent effect of that is, if there is one, or if it's just like or if there's just cards that'll say like if the corporation has bad publicity. Maybe it reduces your hand size. I don't remember. And then there's tagging, which the corporation can do to the runner, that also doesn't super inherently do anything, but there are cards that will sometimes say, like, if the runner's tagged, you get this. And the runner, or the corporation, also has an ability, it's pretty expensive, but they can force the runner to basically discard stuff out of their rig, which is where, like, all their installed cards go. Which is neat, but it's very circumstantial. It depends on the cards you're playing. You may not even see that. Until we played with these Nisei decks that we built, we didn't really ever deal with the tagging stuff all that much. And the NBN definitely has some tagging cards, because I tagged you a lot in the game we played. Didn't really do anything, but I did it. So there's weird edge cases like that. It's cool. I like the idea behind them as status effects. Like, bad publicity makes sense, and getting tagged, right? Like they know your location and they're after you. It's cool. The game is very thematic. Sometimes to a fault. But everything having unique terminology is very frustrating when you're trying to learn it.
This could have like a separate rule book inside of the box. It's just like, all right, this is just the layman's rule book with the discard draw pile and
right. I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that?
I think so.
Okay. So yeah, obviously, I mean, it sounds like a lot of complaining. I did enjoy the game. I've played as a runner and as a corporation now. I want to play it more. I want to do more of the deck building. I like how simple the deck building is. I will say, as convoluted as a lot of the rules are, and the different interactions, because you basically have two different games happening. Like it's very asymmetric. If you like asymmetric things, this is very asymmetric. Yes, you're both using cards, but that's pretty much the only similarity. As convoluted as the rules can be, the deck building rules are very simple. Despite them being really long in the rulebook for some reason, like it's like a page and a half. Don't know why. It basically boils down to, and you've seen the general overview that I did, so I won't bore you with the details, but like minimum or minimum deck size on the left in the like white circle, and then how many influence points they call them, but in the black circles, how many basically like pips from other factions you can use. Mm-hmm. Super simple. There's like almost no rules for deck building, which is kind of nice because it makes it super simple. Hey, you can only include X number of things from other corporations that you can play as, because there's 4 corporations and 3 runner types that you can play as. And so if there's like a really good card, you can just throw that in there, and that costs a certain number of points. I appreciate how simple that is. It's super easy to throw together a deck. You don't have to spend like hours on it. You can basically just pick out a whole bunch of cards and make sure it's just under the influence value, and you can have more than whatever. You just have a minimum of however many cards it says. So I do appreciate that. Maybe it would be good to talk about Nisei. So I think I briefly talked about it in the overview. So Netrunner ended in a year. a few years ago, they discontinued it. Fantasy Flight did. It's due to some licensing stuff with Wizards of the Coast, I think, who owned like not the IP, the game, but not the IP. Because Android is Fantasy Flight's IP, but they didn't own Netrunner, which is Wizards of the Coast. So Fantasy Flight discontinued everything. There was quite a bit of content, from what I understand, for it. It was a pretty long-running card game. In their like LCG style, or I guess it's LCG, of releasing like deluxe boxes and then little data packs, I think they were called. Again, thematic everything, to a weird degree, to the point where it's uncomfortable. That'll be the tagline of the video. Thematic to the point that it's uncomfortable. But so then it had a pretty big following, a pretty big like fan base, very passionate fan base, and Project Nisei was formed, which is basically a non-profit. They can't make any money off of it, and they had to redesign like all the symbols and the way the cards are laid out and everything. They're laid out in the same way, but they had to like basically redo all of it. They couldn't just use the artwork from Netrunner. And they released, they're on like the first half of their second like deluxe expansion that they've done, which is really cool. And it's all just like, it's a fan project. So everything on this table, aside from these tokens, is all Nisei stuff. It's all fan-made content. It's super cool to see that. I mean, that alone is just kind of a neat concept, that there's people who are passionate enough about a game that they're going to not only try to keep it alive by basically creating like another core set, but also like create new content for it. Which I think is just, I don't know, it's just really neat that someone, or that a group of people has, free time that they're willing to spend on designing new cards and having them printed. So the way that it works is you can go to Nisei, I can't remember what their URL is, I think it's Project Nisei, I'll put it in the description. And you can go to their products page, and you can either, I believe you can still print all the files yourself if you wanted to, for free. But if you want them like this, where they're like actual printed cards, you can go through a couple different distributors that they have. The one that they get the largest cut from, that they appreciate the most, is Drive Through Cards. That's where I ordered all of these from. I really like the quality of the cards. They shuffle really nice. They're like very plasticky. I don't know. They're very like, I don't know. They're a nice material. And it's not that expensive. So let's take a quick look at like the different expansions that they have available right now. Okay, so we right now are sitting on the products page for Nisei.net, which is where you can see what products they have available, what's coming up, and get some additional information on them. So when you buy these, it comes in a box with the cards bundled up. They're not in a box or anything, like not a a product box like you'd see if you bought like a Fantasy Flight Deluxe box where they would come in a physical box. These are not going to come in a box. They're basically just bundled little decks of cards that you're going to get. No tokens or anything again. You will have to probably buy those on your own, but we have here the System Gateway, which is the most important one, and that is basically just the very, very bare bones starter set for 2 people to get up and running and playing the game. It's a good way to start, and it doesn't add in any of the deck building stuff. It's just 77 cards, 73 original standard legal cards, and 2 reprints of standard legal cards, and two tutorial cards as well. So this is a great place to start, but if you enjoy it, or honestly I recommend just buying both of these anyway, you are going to want to get the deck building pack as well, because that actually allows you to, gives you more identities, it lets you build your own decks and kind of change things up, gives you a small card pool to work with, and you can buy that actually as a bundle. If we look at that here real quick, the way that they recommend purchasing cards through them is through Drive Through Cards. That is where I've gone through. I've been very happy with that. So you can see they have this bundle here, and it's only $45 for these 2, which is honestly pretty reasonable considering it's basically a whole core set that you're getting. We'll talk more about each of the other items that you can get in this, but this bundle honestly is a pretty good value. It's $180, so if you are a fan of Netrunner, or if you're pretty sure you're going to be, maybe you've played like the online version of Netrunner, this is a pretty great place to start too. This adds all the gameplay content that you could possibly want. So if we go back out here to our products page, the other thing you can get is the System Update 2021, which is basically a bunch of original Netrunner cards, so like actual Netrunner cards, not Nisei cards that they've made, that they have changed the artwork on, are in their style, but have the same names and abilities as the original ones, that you can get those in there as well. I really hope that they make another one of these, because it is expensive to buy original Netrunner expansions, and I would rather not do that. I would rather just buy the Nisei stuff. Cool, and then we go down to expansion packs. So these are going to be like your deluxe sets, if you're familiar with like the Fantasy Flight model, just without any of the little packs. These are just going to be like 2, they do them in 2 halves, so they do first half and then the second half of a cycle. So we have Downfall Part 1 and Downfall Part 2 here, which is called Uprising and Downfall. This was the first one released. It's a little confusing, they have these listed up here, but this was the first one released. Again, more cards, tons of new cards, really like it. This was the first cycle that they did, each one containing 65 cards. Now what's really important is this new set. I'm a big fan of the Midnight Sun set. I don't know if it's just me. I really think the artwork that they've done has come a long way in this set. Like, it looks really good. I really like the Arctic Circle as like a theming, the theming that they used for this one. So you have like shipping lines and things like that, and all sorts of like Arctic equipment and things that are baked into the cards, into the theme of the game, which I really like. And this is the first half of the Borealis cycle. There will be a second half later. You don't need to get the Midnight Sun booster. This was just sort of like a preview before this came out, so this isn't super important anymore. But highly recommend Midnight Sun. Honestly, I highly recommend all of it. I've been very happy, especially if you buy that $180 bundle. It's really not too bad. And you're getting quite a bit of content for a game that otherwise is not going to be getting new content. Hopefully that helped. Back to the video. Yeah, that's just sort of a general overview of what the Nisei stuff looks like. Let's move on to final thoughts. Alright, so final thoughts here. First thing we're going to do in final thoughts is we're going to talk about where this would be on the 3 Cs. So let's plug that in, see kind of what we're feeling. So we start with complexity. There will be a longer description of all of these, of the 3 Cs that we use. It is not a review system. It is meant to be to help people decide whether or not our game is right for them or wrong for them. So there will be longer descriptions in the description, and then also a link to a video if you want some examples of both high and low in each category. But essentially, complexity is going to govern how many different mechanics, things that are going on in the game, how heavy it is, if you will. Comprehension is essentially going to be how long it takes you to learn, grasp the game, be able to teach it. And then consideration is going to be more or less like on a turn-to-turn basis. How much information is there to like process? How many decisions can you make? You could sort of compare it to something like analysis paralysis, where there's just so many different options, or there's too few options, or whatever. Again, not a review system. Each thing will be scored from 1 to 5, and then those will be listed at the end of the video. So, starting with complexity, what would you give this on a scale of 1 to 5?
I think that I would give it around a 2, maybe. I think especially the runner themselves doesn't have a whole lot of like variety that really goes on inside of their things. They're playing cards that have a money cost, so they just spend the money and they play the cards.
Yeah,
and
the runner is much simpler.
Yeah. Like sometimes the running itself can get a little bit confusing, I suppose. But
yeah, the making a run is difficult. I will say it's helped by the fact that there are some decent reference cards that basically list the actions you can do.
Yeah.
And then how many clicks or how many like actions you have available to you, which is good. The corporation is definitely more complicated to play as, because you're basically, again, you're like having to defend all these different things. The runner basically just has to find weak spots to pick at and try to steal those agendas from you. But I was gonna say like a 2.5 to a 3, somewhere a little bit higher, because I do think it's pretty complex for card game. So maybe 2.5, 3 is my opinion. I don't know.
I was kind of thinking higher. Okay, higher than 2, if anything. So yeah.
So, what do you think? 2.5?
2.5. Yeah.
Okay. Split the difference. I agree with that. So 2.5 for complexity. Comprehension. I think this is very high comprehension. This game is one of the hardest for some reason. Again, I don't think it deserves to be this obtuse to try to like learn this game. But I would say like a 4 maybe? It's pretty high, but it's kind of a pain to learn this game. Yeah. Like you have to want to learn this game. This isn't a game that you just pick up and you're like, oh hey, this looks interesting. Because there are very complex games that have, nice, clean, simple rule books that are relatively easy to get up and running. This is not one of them. This is not fun to learn. It is not fun to teach. Once you get there, it's not so bad. Hence the slightly lower complexity. I don't know, what do you think? Is 4 too high?
No, I would honestly say like 4, maybe even 4.5, personally. Because like, yes, like once you get, like I feel like if you get the rules down, yes, it's like really easy to kind of like, but you have to really want to play the game before.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of effort that has to be put in. This is a game that requires you to put in effort to learn it. It's not something that you just sit down at a board game cafe, you crack open the rule book and you're ready to go. It may look like that because it's just a card game. But yeah, there's so many interactions and things, and like you said, like the running is a huge like
how does any of this work. Like we
Yeah.
still did that wrong even after we watched videos and stuff. We had to take it step by step and figure out how all that works. I don't know. I think 4.5 is probably too high. I think probably 4, because I don't want to get too high into like Axis and Allies War Room territory, because I think there are games that are definitely like harder to learn and teach and comprehend and all that stuff. But this one is definitely, you have to put in effort. You have to want to play this game.
I mean, I have to say, just at the very least, just for what it is, it's too high on the consideration. Like, it should be lower. Sorry, yes, comprehension.
We'll get to consideration. So what do you think? That's like a final.
Yeah, 4 is good.
Okay. 4 on comprehension. Consideration. So that again is going to be on like a turn-to-turn basis. All the things you have to consider.
I mean, it has a very average amount of consideration for card games.
Yeah.
Like you're playing cards. So I think I'd probably just give it like a 2.5, 3.
Once again, like the corporation definitely has a lot more to consider.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a big mistake I made when we were playing. Is like you really have to like secure everything because the runner can hit any of these servers just at the beginning of the game. And what we didn't realize the first time we played, the second time we played, is like a runner can access a card in R&D, and if it just happens to be agenda, they can just steal it. So they can just basically like get free points. Same thing I think with the archives. You can basically steal cards out of there.
Corporation discards.
So like
cards.
I didn't realize how important it was to just secure those right away. I was like, oh, it's your draw pile and your discard. Who really cares? Like he gets to, if he accesses it, he just looks at a card or whatever. No, you can just straight up steal the agenda, and that's basically just victory points for the runner. So, but yeah, your hand size. I mean, your starting hand size is 5. The corporation draws a card every turn, but like the runner doesn't even draw a card every turn. They have to take an action. They have to use one of their actions to draw a card. So there's really not like a ton of choices, right? You have a hand of 5 cards. That's not a ridiculous amount of choices. The corporation definitely has more because of guarding the different servers and deciding where you're going to play things and when you're going to advance agendas to try to win the game. But yeah, a pretty average amount of decision making. That's what's weird. This game is like such a weird outlier on that scale of like it's just so obtuse to learn. It's not super super heavy. It's heavy for a card game, and there's not a lot of consideration you do from turn to turn, but like man, the teaching and the learning is just so painful with that cyberpunk language. So 2.5 2. I don't know. It's not really that bad. Yeah.
Which one?
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, let's do each of our final thoughts then. So you can start if you'd like. Just kind of a wrap up about the game. What your personal feelings. So this is again the 3 Cs is supposed to be sort of like neutral, unbiased. This is just like what each of us kind of felt as we played it. So.
Yeah, I think especially as far as card games go, it's like, I mean, I haven't played every card game ever, but like I haven't really seen a lot of asymmetric card games. So like, I think it's very interesting that it fills that role, and it fills it pretty well, even though the like learning curve to get into it is hard. Like the actual gameplay wise, I think fills that area very well, and it makes it unique in that aspect, I guess. And I think there's like a fighting chance for each side, especially like that's an important thing for it being asymmetric. Like we've won games each, I think, and yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I had a lot of fun with it. The teach was painful, but I really appreciate that it is truly asymmetric, because some things just sort of slap asymmetric on them, and it's just because they have different player abilities, and it's like, well, that's yes, technically that's asymmetry, but asymmetric is like you have different things and objectives and ways that you play the game. The way that you approach the game is completely different depending on who you play as. So this does a really good job of that. It's also very thematic. Yes, they have the terminology, but even just like the way that things work, right? You're a hacker assaulting servers, or you're basically a company defending your servers. Like it actually fits really well. It makes sense. You're putting up firewalls to defend your servers, and yes, it's like movie-ified, but like it makes sense what you're doing, and like even like your rig, you're basically upgrading your computer to be better at doing different things and have additional bonuses, and you're doing jobs as a runner to get money, and like they're literally called jobs. Like the resource cards will say like job. You're doing a job to get money. So it's very, very thematic, which is cool. Because not a lot of card games tend to be. I think it's harder for a card game to pull off like thematic, almost as hard as a Euro. So I like that. Again, huge negative is how difficult it is to get into. I will also say there is a tremendous amount of replayability in how each of the factions played. This is something I want to play it more. Like I said, I really like that it's super fast to just build decks. Like you can throw them together really quick. Maybe they're not good, but it's fun, and you can try different factions. Because in looking through the card pools, just with like the Nisei stuff and the core set that I have, each of the factions plays very differently. They have their own unique things that like are only available to them, or really only show up in their cards, which is cool because that gives so much variety to the games. It's like if you get stale playing these two decks, just build two new ones. And then you're maybe one, certain corporations do more with tagging. Some of them probably do more like direct damage to the runner. So there's like different, even within the already asymmetric nature of just the rules and how you're interacting, there's even more asymmetry in each of the factions and how they approach the game too, because it's not the same strategy for every faction of corporations and runners. Like they play the game differently, and they have like different things that they're good at. Which is super cool, and it adds a lot of replayability. Yeah, I don't. Cool. Well, personal score, 1 to 10. What would you give it? I have a hard time with this one, so I'm curious to see what you say. Do you think?
I think I'm kind of thinking 6.5 to 7.
Okay.
It's like close to the mid range. It's a little bit higher, I'd say, than that. I definitely wouldn't put it like in my like really top games necessarily. I don't know.
Yeah. I guess is that your final? We gotta pick one. I have to write it at the end of the video. You can't say 6.5/7. You gotta pick.
All right, 6.5.
Okay. It's funny you should say that, because I was like around a 7 is where, because I really like it. I think it's fun. I think it would be higher for me if it was, and this is going to sound like a really weird complaint, a different theme. I don't particularly hate cyberpunk stuff, but I'm not also particularly enamored with it. I don't know how you would do that, because that's why I'm saying it's a weird complaint. It's not even really a complaint. Weird nitpick or weird like personal thing is like, the theme for me, while done really well, and I can recognize that, is just also kind of like neutral for me. It's not Lord of the Rings, it's not Lovecraft, it's not like, and you couldn't do that because, again, as we've stated, it's very thematic. You're either defending servers or attacking them. Like you couldn't really easily extrapolate it. So that's where I think it falls a little bit for me. I really like it as a card game. I like that it's, again, easy to throw together a deck. Once you've learned the game, it's pretty easy to play. So I think I'm going to say 6.5 too. I'll go 7. 7 is the final answer. So yeah. Well, hopefully you enjoyed the review. Let us know in the comments if you end up purchasing any Nisei stuff or if you've played Netrunner. Always interested to hear about that. But I will continue to buy the Nisei stuff. I think it's really cool to have a fan-made project like that that's doing a really good job. Oh, the one thing I forgot to mention, they have come a really long way in terms of art. The art from like the core set, the System Gateway, not always amazing. Midnight Sun, and even the one before that, the Downfall, they've come a long ways with their art, and I'm willing to look past that just because, again, it's a fan-made project, but they've improved. I've actually been able to see the improvement in terms of the quality. But anyway, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, and until next time, have a great day.